In the year 69 BCE, beneath the sun-scorched skies of Alexandria, a cry pierced through the marble halls of the royal palace. Cleopatra VII Philopator had been born. Some accounts state that the priests of Isis whispered omens that night. A child of the Nile shall rise, whose voice will charm empires and whose fall will echo for eternity. Cleopatra's birth was not marked by celebration, but by uncertainty. The Ptolemaic dynasty, descendants of Greek conquerors, had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, yet their power was crumbling. Rome's shadow stretched across the Mediterranean, and the golden land of the Pharaohs was slowly becoming a puppet in foreign hands. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XIII the Olides, known as the flute player, was a weak and extravagant ruler. He preferred wine, music, and lavish feasts to the burdens of governance. His reign was marked by corruption, famine, and the growing influence of Rome, particularly of the Roman general Pompey, whose gold had helped restore him to the throne after exile. The Egyptian people despised him, calling him a traitor to the gods. Amid this chaos, young Cleopatra was raised not as a pampered princess but as an observer, sharp, curious, and cunning. Unlike her siblings, she learned to speak the Egyptian language fluently, something most of her Greek ancestors had never done. She studied philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and the art of persuasion. Some scholars claim she could speak as many as 9 languages. From her earliest years, Cleopatra understood one truth. To rule Egypt was not to inherit a throne. It was to survive the storm of ambition that surrounded it. In the royal courtyard, she often watched the priests make offerings to Isis, the mother goddess. They whispered prophecies of rebirth and destruction, of a queen who would embody both wisdom and danger. Cleopatra listened, not as a child enthralled by stories, but as a ruler in waiting, deciphering fate. When she reached adolescence, the kingdom's decline grew worse. Famine spread through the Nile Delta. Rome demanded tribute. The people whispered of rebellion. And in the midst of it all, her father fled Egypt once again, leaving behind his daughters to guard the throne. It was then that Cleopatra first learned the cruelty of power. Her sister, Berenice IV, seized the crown and declared herself queen. Cleopatra, barely a teenager, watched as her sister's arrogance led to her downfall. When Ptolemy returned with Roman legions and had Berenice executed. That day, as blood stained the steps of the palace, Cleopatra did not weep. She watched, silent and composed, as the executioner's sword fell. The child was gone. The queen was awakening. By the time Cleopatra turned 18, the throne of Egypt was once again in turmoil. Her father, Ptolemy XIII, had died, leaving his kingdom to be ruled jointly by Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, a boy of barely 10 years. But in Egypt, joint rule was a fragile illusion. Behind the golden masks of ceremony lay the venom of court intrigue. The palace in Alexandria became a labyrinth of whispers. Advisors and eunuchs plotted, priests sought divine approval for rival claimants, and Roman emissaries watched eagerly from the shadows, ready to exploit division. Cleopatra understood that she stood alone. Though she shared the crown, true authority could belong to only one. She wore the uraeus, the serpent of the Pharaohs, upon her brow, not merely as ornament, but as a declaration of her intent, to strike when threatened and to rule with the cunning of a goddess. Her first decree was bold. She removed her brother's regents and began signing royal documents with her own name alone. I, Cleopatra VII Philopator, the seal read, daughter of Isis, queen of Egypt. Some accounts state that Cleopatra personally oversaw grain shipments and trade agreements, ensuring Egypt's survival amid Rome's growing hunger for wealth. She met with scholars, generals, and foreign envoys, her wit and intellect disarming even her most hardened opponents. Yet, for all her brilliance, the serpents of betrayal were tightening their coils. Ptolemy XIII's advisors, led by the ambitious eunuch Pothinus, conspired against her. They whispered to the boy king that Cleopatra sought to usurp him, that she plotted to poison him and claim Egypt as her own. Soon, Cleopatra found herself isolated, her soldiers bribed, her treasury emptied, her allies scattered. One night, under the flicker of oil lamps, Cleopatra fled Alexandria disguised as a servant, her royal silks replaced by coarse linen. Behind her, the palace echoed with the sounds of new power. Her brother's coronation proclaimed, her name cursed. She crossed the Nile under a crescent moon, vanishing into the desert's embrace. But exile did not break her. In the burning sands of Syria, Cleopatra gathered her strength. She met mercenaries, envoys, and priests loyal to her cause. Her eyes burned with purpose. "Egypt will not be ruled by a child," she declared, "nor by Rome's shadow. I will return, not as a fugitive, but as Pharaoh." Far to the west, Rome itself was in chaos. Pompey and Julius Caesar, once allies, were at war. Their feud would soon spill into Egypt, and fate would intertwine Cleopatra's name with theirs forever. The queen in exile had begun her march back to destiny. The year was 48 BCE. The world trembled as Rome tore itself apart. Julius Caesar had triumphed over Pompey at Pharsalus, and the defeated general fled, seeking refuge in Egypt, where once he had aided Cleopatra's father. But Egypt was no sanctuary. When Pompey's ship reached the shores of Pelusium, he was betrayed. Under orders from Pothinus and Ptolemy the Euthyrne's council, Pompey was stabbed to death upon landing, his severed head presented to Caesar as a gift. The young king's advisors believed they were securing Rome's favor. They were wrong. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria and saw the desecrated remains of his rival, he turned pale with disgust. "You have killed a Roman consul upon Egyptian soil," he declared coldly. "You have spilled blood sacred to Rome." As the city buzzed with tension, Cleopatra saw her opportunity. Smuggled through the gates at night, she entered the palace wrapped in a carpet, or as some accounts state, a linen sack, carried by her loyal servant Apollodorus. When the cloth was unrolled before Caesar, the Queen of Egypt emerged, radiant, proud, and unbowed. Her entrance was legend. Caesar, hardened by war and politics, found himself captivated. Cleopatra spoke with the voice of the Nile, smooth, deliberate, and intoxicating. She offered alliance, wisdom, and the promise of Egypt's loyalty if he would help her reclaim her throne. Caesar agreed. War erupted in Alexandria. Streets that once echoed with scholars and merchants now burned with the clash of Roman legions and Egyptian spearmen. Cleopatra and Caesar stood together in the palace, besieged but defiant. Pothinus was captured and executed. The boy king, Ptolemy III, drowned in the Nile during his retreat, his golden armor sinking beneath the waters that had once crowned his ancestors. When silence finally fell over the city, Cleopatra emerged victorious. She ascended the throne once more, now as sole ruler, her title sanctified by both the gods of Egypt and the might of Rome. But as she gazed from her palace balcony toward the horizon, where Caesar's banners fluttered, Cleopatra knew this victory carried a price. For though she wore the crown of Pharaoh, the fate of Egypt now lay entangled with that of a Roman conqueror, and the world would soon learn that the Queen of the Nile could bend even the greatest of men to her will. The palace of Alexandria shimmered like a jewel beneath the morning sun. Marble columns gleamed, and the scent of lotus drifted through open courtyards. Within its walls, two of the most powerful figures in the ancient world sat side by side: Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, and Julius Caesar, dictator of Rome. Their alliance was not merely political. It was the union of two titans who saw themselves as destined to shape history. Some accounts state that Cleopatra saw in Caesar the embodiment of Alexander the Great, the dream of empire reborn. To Caesar, Cleopatra represented the mystique and wealth of the East, a queen who commanded not just soldiers, but the hearts of her people. Cleopatra understood him in ways others did not. She spoke of governance, philosophy, and empire, of how Egypt's stability could enrich Rome if ruled with wisdom. At night, they walked the moonlit gardens beside the reflecting pools, where papyrus reeds whispered like spirits of the Nile. It was there that their son was conceived. Ptolemy XV Philopator, Philometor Caesar, known to history as Caesarion. When the child was born, Cleopatra's heart filled with a fierce, unshakable pride. She saw in him not just her heir, but the promise of a united world, Egyptian and Roman blood intertwined. Caesar visited the temple of Isis himself to honor the child, though Rome's senators whispered in outrage. A foreign queen had ensnared their leader, they claimed. But Cleopatra was no mere lover. She was a strategist in her own right. Under her rule, the Nile once again overflowed with prosperity. Trade flourished, famine waned, and Egypt's temples were restored in golden splendor. Cleopatra presented herself as the living embodiment of Isis, mother, queen, and goddess. Her image adorned coins, her words carried the weight of divine decree. Yet even in triumph, shadows grew. Rome murmured of discontent. Caesar's name had become synonymous with monarchy, a title despised by those who still clung to the Republic. And though Cleopatra accompanied him to Rome, where she lived in a gilded villa along the Tiber, she felt the venomous gaze of Roman matrons and senators alike. Still, she stood tall beside him. When she appeared at Caesar's triumphal procession, dressed in gold and crowned with the uraeus, whispers rippled through the crowd. The Queen of Egypt, they said, has conquered the heart of Rome. But fate, ever jealous of greatness, was already turning. For even the mightiest serpent cannot escape the strike of destiny. Rome, 44 BCE. The city pulsed with tension. Banners of victory fluttered above the forum, but the air was thick with conspiracy. Julius Caesar, now declared dictator for life, had risen above the Senate itself. His statue stood among the gods. To many Romans it was blasphemy, to others a warning. Cleopatra watched all of it unfold from her villa across the Tiber. She had arrived months earlier with Caesarion, believing she was witnessing the dawn of a new age, an empire united under her lover's hand. But Rome was not Egypt. Its politics were a nest of vipers, and those vipers were stirring. In whispered corners of the Curia, men plotted. Brutus, Cassius, and others who feared that Caesar's ambition would destroy the Republic. Some accounts state that omens abounded, a lioness giving birth in the streets, thunder rolling without clouds, and Caesar's own wife, Calpurnia, dreaming of his blood staining her hands. Yet the conqueror, proud and defiant, dismissed them all. On the morning of March 15th, the Ides of March, Caesar prepared to enter the Senate. Cleopatra stood by the window, watching the sunlight scatter across the Tiber. She had urged caution, sensing the storm in the air. He smiled and said only, "The gods have written our fates, my queen." Hours later, Rome shook with the cry, "Caesar is dead." In the Senate House, beneath the marble statue of Pompey, the man who had once ruled the world fell beneath 23 blades. Brutus, the son he had once loved, delivered the final wound. The conqueror of Gaul, the master of legions, lay lifeless upon the cold stone. When the news reached Cleopatra, she did not scream. She dismissed her servants, closed the doors, and stood in silence. Some accounts say she fainted. Others say she prayed to Isis for vengeance. Whatever the truth, from that moment on, the Queen of Egypt was alone again, surrounded by enemies far from home, her protector slain. Rome descended into chaos. Antony, Octavian, and the Senate battled for control. Cleopatra, seeing the danger, fled back to Egypt under the cover of night. Her heart was heavy, but her resolve unbroken. For though the eagle of Rome had fallen, the serpent of the Nile still lived, coiled and waiting to strike once more. In the wake of Caesar's death, the world teetered between order and ruin. His assassins believed they had saved the Republic. Instead, they had unleashed a storm. Civil war raged across Rome, as Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general, and Octavian, his adopted heir, clashed for dominance. From her palace in Alexandria, Cleopatra watched and waited. Egypt, for now, was untouched, its borders guarded, its coffers full. She ruled wisely, strengthening trade and ensuring the loyalty of her people. Yet within her heart burned an old fire. Caesar's memory haunted her, and his legacy, their son Caesarion, demanded protection. News reached her that Antony had defeated the assassins at Philippi. He was now master of the eastern provinces, the lands that bordered her own. Cleopatra knew the time had come to meet him. Their first encounter was legend. In 41 BCE, upon the river Cydnus in Tarsus, Cleopatra arrived to meet Antony not as a supplicant, but as a goddess. Her barge glided upon the water, its sails of purple silk billowing in the breeze. Silver oars struck the river in rhythm to music. The queen reclined beneath a golden canopy, dressed as Isis, her eyes outlined in kohl, her presence radiant as the rising sun. Antony, hardened by war, was struck speechless. The men of Rome had heard of Cleopatra's beauty, but none had prepared him for her intellect, her charm, her command. She spoke to him not as a servant to a conqueror, but as an equal. She reminded him of Egypt's wealth, its grain, its ships, its gold, and how together they could restore order to the world. That night, as feasts echoed across the riverbanks, Antony fell under her spell. But unlike Caesar, he was no statesman. He was a soldier, fierce and impulsive. Cleopatra saw his power, but also his weakness, and she resolved to bind him to her, not only with love, but with destiny. When Antony followed her to Alexandria, their union became the talk of empires. Together they ruled as pharaoh and consort, blending the grandeur of Egypt with the might of Rome. But in the marble halls of the Senate, Octavian watched with growing fury, for he saw not romance, but rebellion. And thus began the final act of Cleopatra's reign, an empire of love and ambition, destined to clash with the rising power of Rome itself. The golden halls of Alexandria had never known such splendor. Under Cleopatra and Mark Antony, Egypt entered its final age of glory, an age drenched in color, ambition, and peril. The Queen of the Nile ruled beside the Roman general not merely as his lover, but as his equal in power and intellect. Together, they revived the city's magnificence. Poets, philosophers, and astronomers flocked to the royal court, where the queen herself presided over debates about the heavens and fate. The people adored her. They called her Philopatress, lover of her country, for she restored faith in the throne, feeding the hungry, and rebuilding the temples of Isis and Hathor. In the festivals of the Nile, she appeared as a living goddess, clad in gold and white linen, her arms outstretched like the wings of the Divine Mother. Mark Antony, meanwhile, was consumed by both passion and politics. Rome's eastern territories demanded his attention, Parthia threatened rebellion, and Octavian's ambition grew with every passing season. But Antony's heart remained in Egypt, in the arms of the queen, who seemed to embody both love and empire. Some accounts state that Cleopatra used this devotion to secure Egypt's sovereignty. She granted Antony ships, soldiers, and gold, not as tribute, but as partnership. In return, he restored to her lands once lost, Cyprus, parts of Syria, and Phoenicia. The boundaries of her kingdom once again touched the glory of ancient times. Their union produced 3 children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, born amid incense and celebration. The queen saw in them the rebirth of Egypt's divine bloodline. She named them after the sun, the moon, and brotherly love, symbols of eternity. But in Rome, tongues wagged with venom. Octavian, cold and cunning, spread whispers that Antony had fallen under a foreign witch's spell. He spoke of Cleopatra as a seductress who had bewitched a Roman general, enslaving him to luxury and lust. The Senate listened, the people murmured, and a shadow began to stretch from the Tiber to the Nile. Still, Cleopatra was unshaken. In her private chambers, she told Antony, "Rome may have given you its armies, but Egypt will give you its destiny. Together we shall rule not as conquerors but as gods." He believed her. and in that belief, both their fates were sealed. In 34 BCE, Alexandria witnessed a spectacle that would forever echo through history: the donations of Alexandria. It was Cleopatra's greatest display of power and vision, and perhaps her most dangerous gamble. On that day, the royal court gathered beneath the blazing Egyptian sun. Processions filled the streets with music and gold. Upon a grand platform, Antony and Cleopatra appeared dressed as gods, he as Dionysus, she as Isis reborn. The people roared with devotion, and the banners of Egypt fluttered like fire in the wind. Antony raised his hand and proclaimed a new order. He granted territories across the eastern world to Cleopatra's children. Alexander Helios was named king of Armenia and Media, Cleopatra Selene, queen of Cyrene and Libya, Ptolemy Philadelphus, ruler of Phoenicia and Syria. Above them all, Cleopatra was crowned Queen of Kings. The crowd erupted in adoration, but beyond the Nile, in the heart of Rome, outrage boiled. Octavian seized upon the event as proof of betrayal. "Has Antony forgotten that he is Roman?" he declared before the Senate. "He kneels to a foreign queen." The accusation struck deep. Even Antony's allies began to waver, fearing that his loyalty had shifted from Rome to Alexandria. Cleopatra, however, remained calm. She knew that empires were not conquered by force alone, but by perception. The donations were more than ceremony, they were strategy. She sought to show the world that Egypt was not a vassal of Rome, but its equal. She was building an Eastern empire, a counterbalance to the power of the West. In the moonlit halls of her palace, she and Antony dined together beneath carved ceilings of lapis lazuli. Musicians played softly as they spoke of destiny. Antony promised her that once Octavian was defeated, their children would inherit a world united beneath their thrones. Cleopatra smiled, yet in her heart she felt the tremor of fate approaching. For she knew that Octavian was no mere politician. He was the serpent in the garden, patient, quiet, and deadly. And as the Nile overflowed that year, the Queen of Egypt could almost feel the tide of war rising with it. By 32 BCE, the alliance between Antony and Cleopatra had become Rome's greatest scandal, and its greatest threat. Octavian's hatred had ripened into purpose. Through speeches and propaganda, he painted Antony as a traitor enslaved by Cleopatra's charms. He read aloud what he claimed were Antony's private letters. Forged or real, it mattered little, where the general allegedly promised to make Alexandria the new capital of the world. "Shall we, sons of Rome," he thundered before the Senate, "bow to the Queen of Egypt?" War was declared. In Alexandria, Cleopatra prepared for the storm. Her fleet, vast and magnificent, was assembled at Actium, a harbor on the western coast of Greece. Row upon row of Egyptian ships, their sails bright as flame, waited under the command of Antony himself. Cleopatra had personally overseen the design of her flagship, its hull gilded, its deck carved with the symbols of Isis. Her presence aboard was both inspiration and warning. She would share in Antony's victory or his doom. Some accounts state that as the two lovers stood upon the prow, she told him, "If we fall, let it be together, not as queen and general, but as two who defied Rome." The battle that followed was chaos. Octavian's admiral, Agrippa, commanded a disciplined, compact fleet. The Egyptian ships, though beautiful, were heavy and slow. The winds turned against them. Smoke darkened the sky. Fire arrows rained upon the decks. The shouts of sailors echoed like the wails of ghosts. As the tide turned, Cleopatra made a fateful choice. Seeing her fleet encircled, she ordered retreat, her ships breaking formation and sailing toward the open sea. Antony, torn between command and love, abandoned his own lines to follow her. His soldiers, leaderless, fell into confusion and defeat. The Battle of Actium was lost. From the shore, Octavian watched the smoke rise over the ruins of Antony's fleet. He smiled. Cold and certain, The Queen of Egypt had fled, but her empire was already bleeding. Cleopatra and Antony returned to Alexandria in silence. The laughter that once filled their halls was gone. The gods no longer smiled. The Queen of Kings now ruled an empire surrounded by enemies, its fate hanging by the thinnest thread. And as the waters of the Nile turned crimson in the sunset, Cleopatra understood that the final chapter of her reign had begun. The year was 31 BCE. The sea had betrayed them, and the gods had turned their faces away. Cleopatra and Antony returned to Alexandria, their city of splendor now a city of ghosts. The once vibrant harbor lay silent. Ships burned or broken, soldiers deserting, nobles whispering of surrender. The Queen of the Nile walked the palace halls like a shadow of her former self, beautiful still, but burdened with despair. Antony, once the Lion of Rome, had become a man undone. He drank heavily, brooded by the fountains, and cursed his fate. His legionaries, loyal but few, clung to memories of glory. Some accounts state that Cleopatra tried to rouse him with words of love and empire, but his spirit had fractured. "Rome will never forgive me," he said, "and you, my queen, have cost me my honor." Cleopatra did not answer, for she knew that the world no longer belonged to men like Antony. It belonged to serpents like Octavian. Still, she would not yield. She sent emissaries to Arabia and Nubia, gathering what allies she could. She fortified the city, filled her treasuries, and armed her ships once more. In the temple of Isis, she prayed not for victory, but for immortality, that her name might live when kingdoms fell. Meanwhile, Octavian advanced across the sea with his legions, cold, methodical, relentless. He promised Rome that he came not to conquer Egypt, but to liberate it from the witch who enslaved its general. Yet in truth he sought more than conquest. He sought vengeance, and the last vestige of Caesar's blood, her son Caesarion. As Octavian's armies neared Pelusium, Cleopatra devised her most desperate plan. She would negotiate. She sent word to Octavian, offering her crown, her wealth, even herself, if Egypt might be spared. Some say she sought only to protect her children. Others claim she meant to seduce Rome's new master, as she had once done with Caesar and Antony. But Antony, hearing whispers of her secret dealings, flew into a jealous rage. "You would betray me to Octavian," he roared, striking his sword upon the marble floor. Cleopatra fled to her tomb, a fortress of stone she had built for herself years before. She sealed its doors and spread word that she was dead. When Antony heard the news, madness consumed him. "She has gone before me," he said softly, "and I am no Roman if I do not follow." He fell upon his own sword. The blade struck deep, but not fatally. Bleeding and broken, he was carried to Cleopatra's tomb. The queen ordered her guards to lift him through the narrow window. And as he died in her arms, she whispered, "Do not leave me alone in this world." The conqueror was gone. The queen was all that remained. When Octavian entered Alexandria, the city bowed in silence. The marble streets that had once echoed with laughter now trembled beneath Roman boots. The banners of the eagle rose above the palace gates, and the last Pharaoh of Egypt was brought in chains before her conqueror. Cleopatra appeared before Octavian not as a prisoner but as a queen. She wore her royal diadem, her gown of white and gold, her face serene. Even in defeat, she radiated majesty. Octavian, young, sharp-eyed, untouched by passion, regarded her with the detachment of a man who had already decided her fate. "You have taken Egypt," Cleopatra said, her voice calm. "But you will never possess it." Octavian's lips curved in a faint smile. "Rome possesses all," he replied. "Even the Nile will bow to the Senate." He promised her mercy, but his eyes betrayed calculation. He intended to parade her through the streets of Rome, a living trophy in his triumph, chained and humiliated. Cleopatra understood the cruelty of that fate. She had seen Pompey's head once offered as tribute. She would not let her own body serve the same purpose. Some accounts state that Octavian allowed her a measure of freedom, to reside in her tomb under guard. Perhaps he believed her spirit broken. But Cleopatra was no ordinary woman. Beneath the quiet obedience, she was preparing her final act. In the dim corridors of her mausoleum, surrounded by gold and incense, Cleopatra gazed upon the treasures of her life, the crown of Isis, the scrolls of the philosophers, the jeweled diadem of her ancestors. She spoke softly to her loyal attendants, Iris and Charmian. "When they speak of me," she said, "let them not say I was conquered. Let them say I chose my own ending." Outside, Octavian prepared his triumphal march. Caesarion, the last son of Caesar, had fled toward the Red Sea, seeking refuge. But even as he fled, messengers brought grim tidings. Octavian's soldiers pursued him without mercy. "There are too many Caesars in this world," the young ruler had said, before ordering Caesarion's death. The gods were silent. The old bloodline was ending. In her tomb, Cleopatra lit a lamp of alabaster and whispered to the statue of Isis, "Mother of the throne, receive your daughter." The world was ready to forget her, but she was not ready to be forgotten. It was the 12th day of August, 30 BCE. The air over Alexandria was heavy with dust and grief. Within the sealed tomb of the last pharaoh, Cleopatra prepared for her final dawn. She dressed herself in the robes of Isis, white linen, threaded with gold. Upon her brow, she placed the serpent diadem, the uraeus, symbol of divine kingship. She lay upon a couch of woven reeds, surrounded by the symbols of eternity, the ankh, the lotus, and the crook and flail of the pharaohs. Iris and Charmian stood beside her, silent and weeping. Some accounts state that a basket of figs was brought to her, a gift seemingly innocent. Hidden within it was the asp, the sacred cobra of Egypt. Cleopatra reached into the basket and lifted the serpent. Its scales shimmered like black glass, its tongue flickering in the candlelight. "So ends a dynasty," she whispered. The asp struck her breast. Pain blossomed like fire, then faded to calm. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes, still open, gazed toward the painted ceiling, toward the stars of Nut, goddess of the sky. Charmian and Iris followed her soon after, by their own hands, loyal even in death. When Octavian's guards broke open the tomb, they found her lying in stillness, her beauty untouched, her hand upon her heart. The asp coiled lifeless beside her. Octavian looked upon the body of the woman who had defied Rome and murmured, "So this is how an empire dies, with grace." He ordered her buried beside Antony in royal dignity. And though Rome carried her treasures away, her legend remained, immortal, unbroken. For Cleopatra was not merely a queen. She was the embodiment of Egypt's soul, proud, intelligent, fierce, and eternal. Her body perished, but her story became the whisper of the Nile, a tale of love and power, of gods and mortals, of a woman who dared to stand against the tide of empire. And even now, when the desert wind sweeps across the sands of ancient Thebes, it is said you can hear her voice, soft as the rustle of papyrus, proud as the cry of a hawk, saying, "I am still here. I am Egypt,